At Thanksgiving dinner, my son stood up and coldly announced that my wife had secretly transferred the entire company I built to him, leaving me with nothing. He thought I was just a powerless victim, abandoned and betrayed by the very people I had spent decades protecting. I took a slow sip of my drink, looked at my wife and whispered, "Should I tell them now? Or would you like to?" They had no idea that while they were plotting to push me out of the company, I had already prepared a secret plan to take everything back. If this opening caught your attention, make sure to like and subscribe so you stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. Please remember, certain elements are fictional and adapted for dramatic and educational purposes. The sharp, rhythmic clinking of a silver fork against a crystal wine glass sliced through the low murmur of our Thanksgiving dinner like a scalpel. I sat at the head of the heavy walnut table, my hands steady as I adjusted my cufflinks, watching the steam rise from a platter of roasted turkey infused with the scent of sage. Dominic Vance, the 62-year-old architect of the region's most efficient supply chain, was a title I had earned through 3 decades of sweat and precision. But as I looked down the length of the table, the warm, golden glow of the brass chandelier seemed to reveal shadows I hadn't noticed before. Cassian Vance, 35, sat to my right in a charcoal suit that cost more than his monthly mortgage, his face etched with a smugness he hadn't earned. He was my only son, a man I had spent years trying to mold into a leader, only to watch him settle for the aesthetics of authority rather than the substance of it. Beside him sat Cressida Morgan, 32, a woman whose architectural designs were known for their structural integrity. She looked at her husband Cassian as if she were seeing a crack in the foundation for the first time. At the opposite end of the table sat Leonie Vance, 59, her double strand of pearls catching the light as she watched me with the eyes of a predator. She was my wife of 35 years, the woman who had ostensibly stood by me while I built Thornton Industrial Supply from a 2-truck operation into a regional powerhouse. I felt a cold prickle of intuition as Leonie gave Cassian a sharp micro-nod. In that moment, the years of partnership dissolved. I realized my own wife had been secretly conspiring with our son to strip me of my company behind my back. You've probably sat at a table like this where the turkey is perfectly golden, but the people around it are rotting from the inside out. It is a peculiar American tradition to mask a slaughter with a celebration. Cassian cleared his throat, the sound grating against the silence that followed the clinking glass. Mom and I have made a decision for the future of the Vance legacy. He began, his voice carrying a practiced projection that lacked any real weight. He didn't look at the food. He looked at the empty space just above my head. He spoke about a stronger, more modern presence at the helm and the necessity of evolving beyond the methods of the past. Blood is thicker than water, but greed is thicker than both. It is the only liquid that can truly drown a family. I didn't interrupt. I watched him with the same clinical detachment I used for a failing logistics node. As of yesterday, I am the majority shareholder, Cassian declared, his smirk finally breaking through his facade. He explained that Leonie had officially transferred her 56% controlling interest to him. The betrayal was complete illegal execution performed over cranberry sauce. "Dad, you're officially relieved of your duties," he said, finally meeting my eyes with a cold, hollow aggression. "Security will be there Monday morning if you try to take any files. Clear your office by then." He wasn't just taking my job. He was attempting to erase my existence from the world I had built. Cassian pulled a thick white legal envelope with a blood-red, urgent stamp from his jacket and tossed it onto the table right next to the bowl of cranberry sauce. I didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, I reached for my scotch, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass like a trapped storm. The clinical white of the legal stationery was an eyesore against the dark, century-old walnut of the dining table, its red stamp screaming with a self-importance that Cassian clearly found intoxicating. I watched him through the thin veil of condensation on my glass, noting the way his hands trembled, not with the hesitation of a son betraying a father, but with the raw adrenaline of a man who believed he had finally caught the king sleeping. I felt the familiar, slow burn of the 18-year-old single malt in my throat, a grounding heat that contrasted with the calculated chill in the room. What Cassian didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom while staring at that urgent stamp, was that I had been tracking this secret takeover for exactly 8 months. I had known about his shell companies before he had even chosen their names. "You've been busy, Cassian," I said, my voice as steady as the ticking of the grandfather clock that pulsed in the hallway like a mechanical heartbeat. "Did you draft this yourself? Or did you use the lawyers I pay for?" Cassian's eyes flickered, the smugness momentarily sharpening into something more defensive. "We did what was necessary for the legacy." Dominic. Leonie interjected, her posture so rigid she looked like a piece of taxidermy. Her pearls seemed to glow with a sickly luminescence under the brass chandelier. Cressida sat beside my son, her gaze shifting from the envelope to her husband, with a mixture of confusion and a slow, growing realization. She was an outsider to this specific betrayal, a structural architect who understood foundations, but had clearly failed to see the rot in her own house. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave and think they were excavating a gold mine? It's a tragic sight usually, but when it's your own flesh and blood doing the shoveling, it's merely information to be processed. The family misread my silence, of course. They saw the paralysis of a broken man, a lion finally toothless and ready for the cage. Cassian leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the weight of his unearned victory, and let out a short, hollow laugh. "It's over, Dad. Just accept it." Gracefully, he gloated, a scent of expensive sage and his even more expensive cologne drifting across the table. Leonie tilted her head, offering a merciful explanation for their coup. "Speaking of my health and the burdens of a modern industry that had supposedly passed me by, silence at a dinner table isn't just an absence of sound. It's a living thing, a predator waiting for the first person to flinch." I let that silence stretch, drawing it out, until the air in the room felt thick as oil. I locked eyes with Leonie, ignoring Cassian entirely, and watched her smile begin to fray at the edges. "Should I tell them now, Leonie? Or do you want to do the honors?" I asked, the words hanging in the air like a cold front. She didn't move, but I could see the sudden tension in the cords of her neck. There was a massive piece of the puzzle, a truth about the very shares she had supposedly transferred that she hadn't even told Cassian yet. I set the glass down with a soft click, the sound echoing like a gavel in the suffocating room, and waited for my wife's first lie. Leonie didn't blink. She simply reached for the serving spoon, her face smoothing into a mask of practiced maternal pity that felt more like a slap than any insult. The silver clinked against the fine china as she shoveled a portion of dried-out prime rib onto her plate, the scent of her overly sweet floral perfume mingling unpleasantly with the smell of sage. "You've been looking so tired lately, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine concern that I now recognized as poison. "This is for your own good." I realized then that she hadn't just been plotting a boardroom coup. She had been bad-mouthing my mental health to the neighbors and the country club set for months, laying the groundwork to justify this takeover as an act of mercy rather than a theft. Cressida Morgan leaned forward, her eyes bright with the spark of a new project. "That office has always been so drab, Dominic," she noted, her tone clinical, as she began detailing plans to gut what she called my stale mahogany relic. She spoke of custom wet bars and leather seating that actually commands respect, as if the respect I'd spent 35 years building was somehow attached to the furniture. Leonie chimed in, suggesting I finally join the local bridge club, or perhaps take up gardening, framing my forced exit as a kindness for my supposed aging mind. I felt the tight, itchy sensation of my starched collar against my neck, a physical manifestation of the trap they were tightening around me. If you're wondering why I didn't flip the table right then, it's because you don't interrupt a predator when they're busy walking into a snare. I let them talk. Let them renovate the tomb they had built for me. Cassian took a sip of his wine, leaning back with a grin that made the mocking glow of the fireplace in the corner seem dim. "You built a nice little sandbox, Dad," he said, dismissing 3 decades of logistics innovation with a wave of his hand. "But the adults are taking over now. The modern vision I'm bringing to Thornton is what the legacy actually needs, especially with the baby coming." He treated my life's work as a secondary footnote to his own unearned future. Leonie topped the insult by reaching into her silk clutch and pulling out a small slip of paper. "We're giving you a 60-day severance package, Dominic. It's more than most would do for an outgoing executive." 60 days. 35 years of my life distilled into a 2-month check. They treated me like a low-level employee being ushered out the back door of my own building. I looked at the number on the slip and felt a new kind of coldness settle in my chest. I knew our internal accounting better than anyone, and the liquid cash required for such a lump sum wasn't sitting in their personal accounts. As I did the mental math, the realization hit me like a physical blow. The very severance they were offering me was being funded by a bridge loan they had taken out in my name while I was on that business trip to Tokyo last month. They were trying to pay me off with my own debt. I watched the steam rise from the prime rib and realized that my family hadn't just stolen my company. They had prepared a shallow grave and expected me to lie down in it with a smile. I didn't reach for the office keys Cassian was demanding. I reached for the weathered leather bag at my feet, the zipper rasping in the silence like a final jagged breath. The sound of that dry metallic slide seemed to stop the very air in the room, cutting through the heavy scent of cold gravy and expensive scotch. My family watched me, their faces illuminated by the flickering brass chandelier, expectantly waiting for me to hand over the physical markers of my authority. Instead, I pulled a sleek, high-definition tablet from the bag's velvet-lined sleeve. I slid the device across the walnut table, the smooth glass surface gliding effortlessly until it stopped directly in front of my son. The blue light of the tablet screen reflected in Leonie's eyes, turning her triumphant gaze into something ghostly and artificial. Leonie leaned in her pearls, clinking against the table edge as she squinted at the text. "Before we discuss your generous 60-day gift, there's a memo you missed," I said, my voice maintaining a level of calm that usually indicated a strategic strike. "Read it aloud, Cassian. I want to make sure everyone hears the transition plan." The text was a company-wide email time-stamped 4 weeks ago and addressed to every single employee of Thornton Industrial Supply. What neither Cassian nor Leonie understood in that moment was that the email wasn't just a resignation, it was a legal trigger. By officially stepping down on that specific date, I had deactivated all my administrative access codes. I had effectively locked them out of my proprietary logistics systems the moment I sent it, leaving them with a hollow shell of a company. Watching them laugh was like watching a group of sailors celebrate finding a hole in the hull, because it meant the ship was finally getting lighter. Cassian's booming, arrogant laughter filled the room as he scanned the first few lines. "You quit. You actually tucked your tail and ran before we could even fire you," he shouted, his face reddening with a surge of unearned victory. He looked at Leonie, who clapped her hands with a delicate, sharp sound. "I'm so proud of you, Dominic," she said, her voice dripping with that maternal pity she used as a weapon. "This shows you still have a shred of sense left. Recognizing your limitations is the first step toward a graceful retirement." They began to toast with their wine glasses clinking crystal in a noisy celebration of a new era for Thornton Industrial. Believe me, there is no sound more hollow than the laughter of a man who thinks he's just won a race he didn't even realize he was disqualified from. Cressida sat quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin, the only one at the table who seemed to notice I wasn't flinching. They were completely oblivious to the legal distinction I was about to draw, convinced that my surrender was absolute. They thought they had inherited a kingdom, But they hadn't realized I'd already moved the throne to a different continent. I didn't just resign from the role. I had vacated the building by moving the furniture first, metaphorically speaking. I sat back, letting their celebration reach its peak, watching the way they looked at each other with such smug certainty. I leaned forward, then the movement slow and deliberate, and delivered the 5 words that would turn their champagne to vinegar. I didn't resign. I relocated. Have you ever wondered why a magician shows you the hat while the rabbit is already in his pocket? I watched Cassian's smug grin falter slightly as the weight of my previous words began to settle, like silt in a glass. He had the bucket now, the limited liability company I'd spent decades building, but he hadn't realized I'd already poured out all the water. I leaned forward, the blue glare of the tablet illuminating the prime rib between us, a cold and unappetizing slab of meat that mirrored the state of the Vance family legacy. Thornton Industrial Supply, LLC, is merely a container. Cassian, a legal box meant to hold value. But a box is only as good as what's inside it. I spoke in a cold, clinical tone that silenced the crackle of the fireplace. I didn't quit my life's work. I just changed the name on the deed. Over the last 8 months, while you were busy picking out the leather for your new office chairs, I was systematically emptying that container into a new, more secure entity, Apex Distribution Group, Inc. The twist that tightened the knot in Cassian's throat was one I had planted years ago. 5 years back, when I restructured the firm, I intentionally left the IP assignment clause out of the original Thornton operating agreement. It was my fail-safe, a contingency plan for a betrayal I hoped would never come, but one I had planned for with the same meticulousness I used for a warehouse layout. A company without its brain is just an expensive, rotting corpse. I turned my gaze to Leonie, whose pearls caught the flickering light as she froze her fork halfway to her mouth. Now we come to the heart of the business, I continued, my voice gaining an authoritative edge. The proprietary routing software that manages 98% of our logistical efficiency, the architecture that made us the most profitable firm in the Rockies, is my personal property. I coded that engine in a freezing basement while you were failing out of your 3rd semester in Boulder, Cassian. Because the operating agreement lacked that assignment clause, the IP never belonged to Thornton. I only let the company use it. Don't look so surprised. You taught me to value assets over people. I just applied the lesson better than you did. I watched the blood drain from my son's face as he stared at the screen, finally understanding the sheer scale of his oversight. As of midnight, the trial period for that software has expired. I have officially licensed it exclusively to Apex Global. As of Monday morning, Thornton Industrial will be running on manual ledgers and outdated spreadsheets. I took a slow sip of my scotch, savoring the burn, and looked at Leonie. She looked as though she wanted to call our family attorney Philip Grayson to fix this mess. It was almost a pity to take that hope away from her. You're probably thinking of calling Philip, aren't you? I asked, the corner of my mouth twitching in a ghost of a smile. I wouldn't bother. Philip has been my personal counsel for months, and he was the one who helped me draft the Apex Articles of Incorporation while you were busy planning this little dinner. Cassian's fork hit his plate with a clatter, his mouth agape as he realized the empire he'd just stolen didn't even have the legal right to use its own logo. I watched the color drain from Leonie's face, leaving her looking every bit the 59 years she'd spent perfecting the art of taking things that didn't belong to her. The silence in the dining room was now absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of their perceived empire. Cassian sat frozen, his mouth still slightly agape, a portrait of a man who had finally realized he was holding a detonator with no bomb. I didn't steal your clients, Cassian, I said, leaning back as the clinical feel of the paper under my fingertips grounded me. They actually suggested the move to a new entity months ago. They'd lost faith in a board that looked more like a social club than a logistics powerhouse. A business is only as good as its promises, son. And those promises expired 60 days ago. I let that sink in, watching Leonie let out a heavy sigh that rattled her double strand of pearls. Every major contract, Costco, Home Depot, and Lowe's, was set for renewal at the end of the third quarter. While you were planning this coup, I simply let those agreements lapse. Instead of renewing under the Thornton name, they signed fresh 5-year exclusive agreements with Apex Global. They chose to follow the person who actually knows how to ship a pallet on time. Do you know what happens to a supply chain when the links are made of paper instead of steel? It snaps under the weight of the first truth. You wanted the title Cassian. You wanted to be the CEO of Thornton Industrial Supply. Well, congratulations. You are officially the king of an empty warehouse. The cold, uneaten prime rib on the table was a fitting metaphor for the prize he'd fought so hard to seize, expensive but dead and rapidly losing value. Leonie, did you really think I'd just hand over 30 years of blood and sweat because you asked nicely, or because you whispered lies to the neighbors about my mental health? Zero. That is the exact dollar amount currently flowing into your new empire. I leaned forward again, the light from the brass chandelier reflecting in the polished surface of the table. While the legal title of the LLC was transferred to you yesterday, the actual business activity ceased being linked to that name weeks ago. I've rerouted the accounts receivable. There isn't a single penny coming in on Monday to pay the warehouse staff, the drivers, or the electricity bill. You're holding a hollow corporate husk, a shell that still has my name on the mortgage, but none of my money in the bank. I watched them both, my expression as unyielding as the logistics grids I'd spent my life perfecting. They had tried to bury me, but they hadn't realized I was the one who owned the cemetery. But here is the most important lesson in business. Cassian, the container may be empty of value, but it is overflowing with accountability. You see, while Thornton Industrial has no income, it still possesses every single liability. Every debt, every outstanding lawsuit, and every massive overlooked bill I decided not to settle during the transition is now your personal responsibility. I pulled a second file from my leather bag, this one a deep, ominous navy blue that caught the reflection of the flickering chandelier. I slid it across the walnut table toward my son, watching his eyes widen as he saw the embossed letterhead of the Aurora Industrial Landlord. Open it, Cassian. Face the numbers. I watched Cassian's fingers tremble as they brushed the brass clasps of the Navy portfolio, the metallic click sounding like the hammer of a gun cocking in the silence of the dining room. He hesitated, the smell of ink and old paper beginning to compete with the heavy, stale air of a meal that had turned into an execution. Open it, son. I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. Face the numbers. When he finally peeled back the cover, the visual of his knuckles turning white against the dark leather told me he already knew he was looking at a grave. I had spent months curating this specific inventory of ruin. The first page was a stark notice from our landlord at the 75,000 square foot Aurora warehouse. Since Thornton had lost its anchor tenants, the ones I had rerouted to Apex Global, the landlord was exercising a clause demanding a massive immediate security deposit renewal. Physical assets aren't a trophy, Cassian. They're a hunger that never stops. Beneath that lay a stack of final notice maintenance invoices for our 40 delivery trucks and the automated sorting equipment. I had intentionally deferred the state taxes and these maintenance schedules for exactly 3 months, knowing the bill would land precisely on the day after the transfer was finalized. I watched his eyes dart across the figures, the red ink bleeding into his consciousness. Read it aloud, Cassian. It's the only thing you truly own now. If you think I'm being cruel, remember this. I didn't put the pen in his hand. Arrogance did that all on its own. He looked up, his face ashen, and stammered that the company would just file for bankruptcy to wipe the slate clean. I leaned in the shadows from the brass chandelier, casting long, predatory lines across the walnut table. The bank doesn't want the warehouse, Cassian. They want you. I pointed to the signature line on the transfer documents he had so gleefully signed. Because you signed as executive officer and successor, you became the primary personal guarantor for every single corporate debt. You didn't just inherit a desk. You inherited an anchor, and you're the only one tied to it. A personal guarantee is a legal marriage that doesn't allow for divorce, only for the slow, agonizing death of your credit score. Total it up, I commanded. $2.3 million is due within 14 days to keep the lights on and the trucks insured. If you don't pay, they won't just take the office furniture. They'll take your cars, your personal savings, and every future paycheck you might struggle to earn. Leonie sat frozen, her double strand of pearls catching the flickering light as she looked from her son to the papers. She had thought she was funding a new era. She hadn't realized she was funding a bankruptcy that had her name written in the margins. The math was simple, and the cage was now locked. Cassian looked like a man who had just realized the parachute he stole was actually a backpack full of lead. I watched him try to find a loophole in the fine print, but there was none. I had cleared the company's operating accounts to the point that the $600 remaining wouldn't even cover the legal fees to file for the very bankruptcy he was praying for. Leonie's water glass shattered in her hand, the shards littering the walnut table as she realized the $300,000 she'd taken for her retirement was about to be clawed back by a bankruptcy court. Leonie's eyes weren't filled with tears. They were burning with the frantic, calculating rage of a woman who had just realized the gold mine she'd stolen was actually a mountain of radioactive waste. She stared at the glass shards littering the dark walnut table, her chest heaving with labored, shallow breaths that seemed to echo under the low hum of the brass chandelier. "I'll have our lawyers freeze every penny you moved." "Dominic!" She screamed, her voice cracking as she leaned over the ruined Thanksgiving spread. "You have a duty to this company. You've sabotaged our family assets, and I will see you arrested for fiduciary breach." I remained silent, letting the sound of her frantic threats bounce off the walls until she finally exhausted her vocal cords. "Duty is a fascinating word, Leonie," I said quietly, reaching back into the Navy portfolio. "Especially when you've already signed it away." What neither of them knew was that the luxury golf trip to the Scottsdale Fairmont I had gifted her in mid-September wasn't an act of affection. It was a strategic deployment. I had paid for that getaway specifically to ensure she would be thousands of miles away, distracted by the sun and 4 margaritas deep into a liquid afternoon when my legal team went to work. I pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from the file, a printed DocuSign certificate that seemed to glow with a blinding white intensity under the dining room lights. "Remember hole 14?" I asked, sliding the paper toward her. "You didn't want to stop playing to read the fine print of a routine tax filing email, did you? You just wanted that annoying notification off your screen so you could focus on your putt. A digital signature is a permanent stain. You can't wash it away with a few desperate lies and a loud voice." I pointed to the bottom of the page where the metadata was laid out with surgical precision. "This isn't a trick, Leonie. It's a digital footprint. This document explicitly authorizes the transfer of all intellectual property and existing contracts from Thornton to Apex Global. It records your exact GPS coordinates from the resort, the unique IP address of your phone, and the timestamp 2:14 p.m. In the back of my mind, I could almost smell the faint scent of chlorine and ozone from that Scottsdale afternoon, a world away from this suffocating room. If you're ever offered a free trip by someone you're trying to rob, maybe you should read the emails they send you while you're there. Leonie reached for the paper, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly knocked over the gravy boat. She scanned the lines, her eyes widening as she reached the supplemental clause I had buried in the legalese. By signing, she hadn't just approved the transfers. She had formally admitted that she was aware the old company was insolvent. I had effectively turned her into a co-conspirator in the very fraud she was currently trying to claim. I watched the realization sink in, a cold weight pressing down on the room. Leonie's face went from an angry crimson to the color of wet ash as she realized her own thumbprint on a screen had just cost her the only leverage she ever had. She looked at me, her mouth working, but no sound coming out, as the legal cage I had built around her finally clicked shut. Cassian snatched his smartphone from the table with such violence that a splash of cold gravy landed on his charcoal sleeve, but he didn't even notice. He was breathing in shallow, ragged bursts, his face a pale mask of desperation as he looked at me. "Paper doesn't run supply chains, Dad. People do," he spat, his voice trembling with a bravado that was rapidly coming apart at the seams. "And Leonard Foster loves me. We spent 3 days in Vail together last month. You think a legal technicality is going to make him walk away from a 10-year partnership? Watch closely. This is how a real executive handles a crisis." He tapped the screen with a shaking finger and hit the speakerphone button, leaning over the device as if it were an altar. The dining room was so silent, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of my son's public execution. The first ring sounded tinny and electronic in the heavy air. Leonie sat perfectly still, her face the color of wet ash as she stared at the phone. The second ring was cut short. "Hello," Leonard Foster's voice was unmistakable, booming, direct, and currently sounding very distracted. "Leonard, it's Cassian Vance." "Happy Thanksgiving," my friend Cassian said, his voice jumping an octave as he tried to force a joviality that wasn't there. "Listen, I'm calling as the new CEO of Thornton. There's some confusion with the transition, and I wanted to personally assure you the ringing of a phone is a lonely sound when no one on the other end wants to hear your voice." And the silence Leonard offered in return was deafening. "I don't know what game you're playing," Cassian Leonard said, his tone shifting from distracted to icy in a heartbeat. "But Thornton is a ghost ship. We deal with Dominic or we don't deal at all. We severed ties with Thornton weeks ago because of the instability you caused during your tenure as VP. In fact, those quarterly reports you filed were so riddled with errors and missed deadlines that our legal team had all the justification they needed to trigger the early exit clause. Have you ever seen a man realize he's the punchline of a joke he's been telling for years?" Cassian's mouth worked, but no sound came out as he stared at his own reflection in the black phone screen. Leonard continued, relentless. "We've already signed an exclusive agreement with Apex Global. Don't call this number again, Cassian. Our legal department has been briefed, and any further contact will be viewed as harassment. Goodbye." The dial tone droned on like a flat line marking the official death of my son's career. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my scotch. What Cassian never realized was that I hadn't just won the Costco contract. I had intentionally let him handle those last 3 quarterly reports. I knew he was too lazy to check the math and too arrogant to ask for help. I paved the way for him to fail so spectacularly that Leonard was practically begging me to start a new company just to escape the wreckage my son was creating. I set my glass down with a soft click. The dial tone finally faded into an absolute heavy silence. But the look Cressida was giving the Michelle folder told me the real execution was only just beginning. I didn't let the silence from the Costco call linger. I simply flipped to the third tab of the Navy portfolio, the one highlighted in a fluorescent, unapologetic yellow. The tactile snap of the portfolio rings echoed against the walnut table as I pulled out a set of corporate credit card statements from March 2024. A $22,000 charge for a VIP weekend at the Wynn in Las Vegas glowed under the brass chandelier. I didn't realize our industrial pipes were so popular at the blackjack tables. Cassian, I noted my voice, a calm, steady rhythm against the sound of his heavy, panicked breathing. What Cassian didn't know was that I had issued him that specific secondary corporate card 2 years ago, precisely because I knew he couldn't resist abusing it. I had handed him the shovel, and I had spent 24 months watching him dig. He sat frozen, the smell of cold, uneaten gravy suddenly heavy in the air. I pointed to the itemized list bottle service, a high-roller suite and a private cabana. He had claimed it was for vendor entertainment, but our company has 0 clients in Nevada. I had already cross-referenced the dates with our fleet GPS. Every truck we owned was sitting in a Denver bay, while that card was being swiped for pretend importance in the desert. Cressida's head snapped toward her husband, her face pale. "You told me you were at a logistics seminar in Omaha that weekend, Cassian," she whispered. "You showed me the brochure." He didn't answer her. He couldn't. "Do you know what the IRS calls miscellaneous vendor expenses that look like a bachelor party? They call it a felony." My son's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table. I didn't stop. I turned the page to July 2024, exposing a $60,000 wire transfer to an offshore digital currency exchange. It had been categorized in our software as a freight tariff, a clumsy bit of labeling that wouldn't fool a first-year auditor. "You weren't even trying to be clever," I said, watching Leonie's eyes dart between the papers. He had used operating capital to buy speculative NFT tokens that crashed into worthlessness within 72 hours. This wasn't just a bad investment. It was a commingling of personal and corporate funds that constituted textbook wire fraud. $82,000. That's more than most of my warehouse staff earn in 2 years, evaporated for a weekend of pretend importance and a digital image of a cartoon ape. I looked Cassian dead in the eye, seeing the boy who used to steal $20 bills from my dresser, now playing games with federal law. "This red folder doesn't just stay on this table, Cassian. It goes to the Internal Revenue Service the moment you try to file that injunction or question my transition of Apex Global." He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as the legal entrapment became absolute. I had already pre-filed a suspicious activity report with the bank weeks ago. His accounts were already being monitored by fraud investigators, a silent net I had cast while he was still celebrating his takeover. The trap was locked, barred, and bolted. I reached into the very back of the folder and pulled a glossy slip of paper. It was a receipt from a jeweler on 17th Street, the reflection of the chandelier dancing on its surface. I slid it across the table, watching it glide until it came to rest directly in front of Cressida's empty wine glass. I didn't say a word as Cressida picked up the receipt, her eyes scanning the itemized list with the clinical precision of an architect looking for a flaw in a blueprint. The thermal paper crinkled under her touch, a sharp, brittle sound that seemed to grate against the heavy silence of the dining room. I watched her look at the date, December 2024. Then her eyes fixed on the description of the item, an $18,000 diamond tennis bracelet. Instinctively, her hand went to her own bare wrist, which held nothing but the simple silver watch I had given her for her birthday 3 years ago. I felt the cold, metallic weight of my own watch against my skin as I watched her realization dawn. "I don't recall seeing that on your wrist at the Christmas gala, Cressida," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a cold front. I pointed to the accounting classification on the sheet year-end manager bonus. I asked if any of the warehouse staff mentioned receiving 5 carats of diamonds last Christmas. Cassian's fork scraped uselessly against his plate, a sound of metal on porcelain that set my teeth on edge as he fumbled for a lie. He tried to claim it was a gift for Leonie that she had simply misplaced. But Leonie's silence was a heavy, suffocating thing, the flickering shadow of the fire playing across her guilty face. She didn't just know about the affair. She had actively encouraged it to keep Cassian compliant with her own plans for the company. $18,000 of carbon and greed. It's amazing how something so small can crush a marriage so completely. I flipped to a text log export I had obtained from the company server. I read a message sent to a contact, saved only as Michelle with a heart emoji, Leonie's own niece. The messages revealed a 2-year affair funded entirely by Thornton Industrial's business expenses. "Who is Michelle?" Cressida asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You knew Leonie. You watched me struggle with the mortgage while he was buying your niece diamonds. If you think the theft of a company is ugly, you haven't seen what happens when a family starts stealing each other's souls." I didn't stop. I revealed that Michelle had been interning at the company for a year on a ghost salary, also funded by the assets Cassian just inherited. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was a systematic siphoning of the very lifeblood of the company to support a second life. I watched Leonie's double strand of pearls catch the light as she looked down at the table, refusing to meet Cressida's gaze. Cassian looked like a cornered animal, his face a sickly shade of gray under the brass chandelier. He had been so focused on taking my crown that he hadn't realized I'd already seen the rot he was hiding under his throne. This diagram shows exactly how the manager bonus was routed through a shell vendor to hide the jewelry purchase. Cressida didn't scream. She just slowly stood up, her hand hovering over her pregnant belly, looking at Leonie as if she were a venomous snake that had finally stopped pretending to be a pet. The absolute icy moral disgust in the room was so thick I could almost taste it. And for the first time that night, the Vance name felt like a curse I couldn't wait to shed. Cressida didn't look at Cassian. She looked through him, her gaze anchored on Leonie with the terrifying stillness of a structural engineer, realizing she was standing in a building about to collapse. The air in the dining room had turned brittle, smelling of cold, sage-infused grease and the sharp, metallic tang of a dying dinner party. I felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of my heart against my ribs as I watched the daughter-in-law I had come to respect finally confront the predator at the end of the table. "Tell me the truth about the investment," Cassian. Cressida said, her voice a low, vibrating hum that made the silver on the walnut table seem to rattle. Cassian's eyes darted toward his mother, looking for a script that was no longer being provided. Under the weight of her silence, he finally broke, confessing that Leonie had convinced them to take out a $500,000 second mortgage on Cressida's pre-marriage home. The goal ostensibly was to buy out Leonie's 56% stake in Thornton Industrial. I watched Cressida's hands press into the hard, cold walnut of the table, her knuckles white, as she realized she had been groomed for months. Leonie had played on her desire for a family legacy, for a secure future for the baby, just to extract her personal equity before the company's internal rot became public knowledge. "You knew this was a hollow shell," Leonie. Cressida whispered, her shallow, shaky breaths the only sound in the suffocating room. "You let me mortgage my life for your son's ego." Leonie didn't flinch, her predator eyes unblinking and cold. "It was a legitimate business transaction, Cressida," she replied with a sociopathic calmness. "Due diligence was your responsibility, not mine. Family isn't a safety net for people like Leonie. It's a harvesting ground." I reached into the portfolio and pulled a copy of the mortgage agreement. "What Cassian hasn't told you," I interjected, "is that Leonie drafted these documents herself. She used a template that specifically waived your right to an independent audit of the company assets." "Give me back my money, Leonie." "Right now," Cressida demanded, her voice rising with a desperate, sharp edge. Leonie simply took a slow sip of her wine, her double strand of pearls catching the light. "That money is already moved into an irrevocable retirement trust, dear. It's gone. Even I can't touch it now." She looked at Cressida's stomach with a clinical detachment. "Focus on your breathing. Tension is bad for the baby. If you think your own mother wouldn't rob you to keep her country club membership, you've never met a narcissist with a mortgage to pay." "The Vance legacy," Leonie continued, "is bigger than one house in a middle-class neighborhood." I watched Leonie's mask of maternal guidance disintegrate, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of her greed. She had robbed her own unborn grandchild to secure a lifestyle she didn't earn. What she didn't mention, however, was that $50,000 of that mortgage money had already been spent as a down payment on a luxury condo in her name, only a bolt hole for when the Ridgemont house inevitably went on the block. Cressida looked at her wedding ring, the diamond mocking her in the chandelier light, before her hand slowly moved toward the band with a terrifying final resolve. The sound wasn't loud, but in that suffocating room, the sharp clack of the platinum band hitting the walnut table sounded like a gunshot. I watched the ring roll for a fraction of a second, before it wobbled and died, coming to rest squarely on top of the legal transfer papers Cassian had pushed toward me earlier. Cressida stood tall, her presence expanding to fill the vacuum left by my son's crumbling ego. I noticed then that she wasn't just reacting. She was executing a plan 48 hours ago. After noticing Leonie's odd behavior and a sudden interest in her personal equity, she had quietly moved her personal savings and premarital assets into a separate account. She had seen the crack in the foundation before any of us had even acknowledged the rot. "I'm not raising a child in a house built on theft and mistress's diamonds," she said, her voice a cold, absolute resolve that made Leonie's pearls seem to rattle. "I will be filing for an emergency divorce and seeking full custody of our child on Monday morning." She turned her gaze to Leonie, whose unblinking predator eyes were finally showing a flicker of genuine fear. "Good luck protecting that trust, Leonie. I'm going to make sure every penny you stole is dragged into the light of a courtroom. A home is a structure. A marriage is a foundation. When the foundation is sand, the structure has to fall." I sat back watching the wreckage of my family with the same detached calculation I once used to analyze a bankrupt vendor. Cassian reached out his hand, hovering near the gravy boat trying to grab Cressida's arm. He began to stammer a plea, something pathetic about the baby needing a father and the Vance name, but she stepped back with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Don't touch me, Cassian." She snapped her words, cutting through the smell of sage and cold, congealing gravy. "You're not a husband. You're just a parasite who lost his host." She turned to me, then her expression softening for only a heartbeat. "I'm sorry, Dominic. You were right about the rot in this house. I wish I had listened to your warnings years ago. You can always buy more diamonds. You can never buy back the dignity you sold for them." I offered her a slight solemn nod, acknowledging the only person in this room who had maintained their structural integrity. She grabbed her designer purse from the chair, the leather creaking in the silence. As she stepped toward the foyer, she mentioned that her sister was already waiting at the end of the driveway. She had an exit plan ready before the first course was even served. The heavy final thud of the mahogany front door echoed through the house, a sound that carried more finality than any legal document. The front door slammed shut, a gust of freezing November air rushing in to replace the warmth she took with her, leaving only the three of us and a room full of cold, expensive lies. I looked at the empty seat beside me and felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The fire was finally out of control, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel the need to reach for an extinguisher. I stared at the ring on the table, knowing it was the last honest piece of metal in Ridgemont Heights. The silence that followed the slamming door didn't just hang in the air. It pressed against us, heavy and suffocating, until the first sob broke from my son's throat like a physical wound. Cassian stared at the empty space where Cressida had stood, his face a pale, sweating mask of disbelief. Suddenly he collapsed, sliding from his chair until he was on his knees on the hardwood floor beside me. His hands, trembling and damp, reached out to grab the hem of my silk coat. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice cracking into a jagged, rhythmic sobbing. "I'll do anything. I'll sign it all back. I'll merge Thornton with Apex. Just don't let them take everything I have. Save me from the guarantee." I looked down at him, feeling the tug on my garment and the smell of cold, prime rib fat clinging to the air. It was a pathetic display. I saw only a stranger where my pride used to be a hollow man, begging for a reprieve from a debt he had gleefully manufactured. I had known about Leonie's secret offshore account in the Caymans for 5 years, a little nest egg she thought was invisible, and I had chosen to leave it alone until this exact moment of total reckoning. "Let go of my coat, Cassian," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterics with surgical precision. "You're getting sweat on the only thing in this room that actually has value." I stood up, forcing him to release his grip. There is nothing more dangerous than a man who has finally stopped caring what his family thinks of him. I looked at the two of them, Leonie frozen in her chair, and Cassian shivering on the floor. For decades, I was the draft horse of this family. I said my words resonant in the high-ceilinged room. I pulled the heavy plow through the mud, while you paraded around wearing ribbons you never earned. I shrunk my own soul so you could feel tall. I detailed the sacrifices they had ignored, the 90-hour weeks, the nights spent sleeping on concrete warehouse floors to ensure a shipment was on time, and the relentless pressure of keeping a legacy afloat. You treated me like a communal bank account, a utility to be switched on and off. Loyalty is a two-way street, but in this house it's always been a dead-end alley where I was the only one paying the toll. I watched the glint of the brass chandelier reflected in my own steady eyes as I looked at Leonie. The family loyalty you're now weaponizing was a bridge you burned the moment you tried to steal my life's work. You wanted the heavy crown, Cassian. Now you get to feel exactly how much it weighs as it snaps your neck. My son's face pressed into the rough texture of the hardwood, his tears wetting the grain. He didn't realize that those legendary 90-hour weeks weren't just for Thornton. I had been using that time in the shadows for years to build the entire infrastructure, the vendor networks, and the digital backbone of Apex Global. I had been building my exit since the day I realized my son was a predator in training. I adjusted my cufflinks and looked at the two people I had spent my life protecting, and for the first time, I didn't see family. I saw parasites without a host. I pulled a sleek, leather-bound checkbook from the inner pocket of my coat, the sound of the gold zipper echoing like a final metallic snap in the tomb of our dining room. The scratching sound of my fountain pen on paper was the only rhythm left in a house that had just been gutted of its dignity. Leonie watched me with wide, panicked eyes, her chest heaving as she gripped the edge of the walnut table. What she didn't realize was that this check for $85,000 was drawn from an account I hadn't touched since 1992, a small, quiet fund I had kept specifically for the day I would finally walk away. I carefully wrote out the amount 33.5 years after I had first borrowed that exact figure to secure my original warehouse lease. I paid it back with interest within 18 months, but you've used that single gesture to leash me for 3 decades. I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. Consider this the final payment for the 30 years I spent shrinking myself to fit into your curated life. You didn't lose a husband tonight, Leonie. You lost a meal ticket. I tore the check from the book with a sharp, satisfying rip and dropped it onto the center of the cold, ruined prime rib, watching it flutter for a second before sticking to the congealed fat. All debts, financial and emotional, are officially settled. Paid in full. It's funny how much cheaper it is to buy your freedom than it is to rent your dignity. Leonie erupted into hysteria, her face twisting into a mask of pure shriek. If you leave Dominic, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? Dead. You will be erased from our history. She screamed, her voice reaching a pitch that made the crystal glasses rattle. I didn't even pause. I walked into the foyer, the smell of cold pine and the stinging November wind leaking through the doorframe. I grabbed my wool coat, feeling the weight of the last 35 years evaporate as I stepped over the marble threshold for the last time. Have you ever tasted air that didn't smell like someone else's expectations? It's cold, sharp, and absolutely addictive. I've never felt more alive. I whispered to the empty porch as her shrieking continued behind me. I walked toward my SUV, my footsteps crunching on the wet asphalt. I started the engine, the rumble of the V8, a steady, powerful contrast to the chaotic sounds of my son's sobbing and my wife's screaming echoing from the open front door. As I pulled out of the circular driveway, the biting wind on my face felt like a benediction. I realized then that the only person I felt a genuine twinge of regret for leaving was the baby Cressida is carrying a soul who shouldn't have to pay for the sins of the Vance name. But I already have a plan for that, a way to be a grandfather without being a victim. I watched the massive brick colonial shrink in my rearview mirror, the warm lights of the house looking like nothing more than the fading embers of a fire I had finally stopped trying to put out. I turned onto the main road, the blur of Denver city lights through the windshield signaling the start of a life where the only person I had to answer to was the man staring back at me in the mirror. The hum of the highway beneath my tires was the first honest conversation I'd had in 30 years, a steady, rhythmic promise of distance from a life I should have left a decade ago. As the neon-lit streets of downtown Denver blurred past my windshield, the predatory heat of the Ridgemont dining room began to recede into a cold, clinical memory. I navigated through the light holiday traffic with a precision that felt new, unburdened by the parasitic expectations of the people I had just left behind. I pulled into the valet of the Brown Palace Hotel, a landmark of luxury that stood as a bastion of anonymity for a man in my position. I didn't want the familiar comfort of the suburban country club circuit. I wanted a place where the heavy mahogany doors and thick carpets would act as a soundproof barrier between me and the Vance legacy. What Leonie and Cassian didn't know was that I hadn't simply fled in a moment of impulse. I had had this specific suite pre-booked under a corporate alias for the last 3 weeks. I knew the Thanksgiving dinner would be the breaking point the moment the fever of their greed finally peaked, and I had prepared my sanctuary accordingly. I checked in with a brief nod to the staff, feeling like a ghost, despite using my own name. I had nothing with me but my leather bag and the clothes on my back, yet I had never felt more equipped. The quiet of the lobby was a physical relief, a stark contrast to the shrieking hysteria I had left in my wake. Have you ever noticed how much louder silence is when you've spent your life screaming inside your own head? It is a deafening, beautiful thing. Once inside my room, the heavy door clicked shut with a finality that signaled the end of my tenure as the family draft horse. I sat on the edge of the bed, the cool, crisp smell of high thread count linens grounding me. I finally drew my phone from my pocket. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue light that illuminated the dark corners of the suite. 47 missed calls. 47 attempts to find a wallet that had finally walked away. The texts from Leonie and Cassian were a toxic slurry of begging and vitriol, alternating between claims of undying love and threats of legal ruin. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I systematically blocked both numbers and deactivated my personal social media accounts, severing the digital cord that linked my identity to their chaos. 35 years of noise silenced with a single swipe. I wasn't hiding. I was just finally out of range. I stripped off my suit and stepped into a long, hot shower, letting the steam fill the room as I watched the day's grime disappear down the drain. I was literally washing the scent of sage and congealing gravy off my skin, purging the very essence of the Vance household. For the first time in 8 months, I didn't have to plan my next breath around their insatiable hunger. As I unpacked my leather bag, I pulled out a small, rugged backup hard drive. It contained the only existing copy of the source code for the routing software, the digital brain of the company. I had the only key ensuring that no matter how many locks they changed at the office, they couldn't hack their way back into the empire I had already relocated. I set the phone on the nightstand face down and let the darkness of the room swallow me whole, unaware that the first ripples of my departure were already turning into a tidal wave at the Aurora warehouse. The vibration of the hotel phone on the nightstand at 7 a.m. Saturday was a rhythmic intrusion that found me already awake watching the slow climb of the winter sun over the Denver skyline. I felt rested my mind, a sharp surgical instrument prepared for the strategic endgame. Monday morning didn't arrive with a sunrise. It arrived with the cold, heavy clank of a locksmith's van door sliding open in front of the Thornton industrial gates. I sat in the dim light of my hotel suite, the cold blue glow of my laptop screen, reflecting the grainy black and white visual of the security feed. What Cassian never realized was that the security system contract was never in Thornton Industrial's name. I had been paying for it personally for years to ensure my eyes remained active even if I was ousted. I watched the landlord's security team step out into the freezing Aurora air, their breath blooming in white plumes as they prepared to change the locks for non-payment of the security deposit I had so carefully deferred. At exactly 8 a.m., Cassian pulled up in his SUV, the tires crunching over the frozen gravel. He stepped out, looking every bit the defeated heir in his charcoal suit, clutching that useless white legal envelope like a religious icon. I watched him approach the gates, his posture shifting from confusion to a jagged, frantic rage when the guards barred his way. Angela Morrison, my operations manager for 15 years and the only person who knew where every literal and figurative body was buried at Thornton, spoke with a clipped professionalism that hid her amusement when she called me moments later. Dominic. He's losing his mind in the parking lot. She reported, the sound of her voice a steady anchor in my ear. I'm the CEO. You can't keep me out of my own building. He's screaming. Should I call the police or just keep watching? Keep watching, Angela. I replied, a sense of righteous satisfaction warming me more than the hotel coffee ever could. Owning a building is easy. Keeping the doors open when you've lost the key to the truth is impossible. I watched my son retreat to his car, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He began making phone calls, his lips moving rapidly as he gestured toward the warehouse bays he no longer controlled. Using the lip-reading software I'd integrated into my personal monitoring suite, I watched the words take shape, Titan meeting, and data. My son was looking for a life raft, and true to his nature, he was trying to sell company secrets to the very rivals he'd once mocked. I dialed Robert Hayes, my tech director, who was standing by for my signal. Execute the mongoose, Robert. I commanded, the sharp clicking of my computer mouse puncturing the silence. Make sure the software 2.0 folder is the easiest thing for him to find on the remote server. Do you know what happens to a cornered animal when it sees a trap that looks like an exit? It doesn't look at the floor. It only looks at the light. He's looking for a life raft, I noted to Robert as I watched Cassian speed away from the warehouse. Let's make sure it's made of lead. Cassian wasn't just calling any competitor. He was calling Titan Supply, a firm I had intentionally lost a contract to months ago, just to establish a false, tempting relationship for him to exploit. I watched the status bar on my laptop turn from red to a steady pulsing green, confirming the bait was set and the mongoose was hungry. I didn't need a high-definition lens to recognize the desperation in Cassian's posture as he sat in a corner booth of a downtown coffee shop, clutching a manila folder like a shield against the world he'd just broken. On my laptop screen, the grainy surveillance photos from my private investigator showed him leaning forward, his face etched with a frantic energy that usually preceded a catastrophic mistake. I adjusted my headphones, the static-filled audio from the bug, picking up the sharp hiss of a milk frother in the background and the distant clink of ceramic. I knew this shop well. The owner was a former driver I had helped through a crippling medical crisis years ago. On his private property, with his full consent, this surveillance was as legal as it was necessary. Julian Thorne, the VP of Titan Supply, was a man whose ambition was only matched by his lack of ethics, the perfect buyer for a stolen legacy. He sat opposite my son, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the smell of burnt espresso beans that saturated the air. It's all here, Julian. I heard Cassian whisper, his voice thin and reedy through the speaker. The logic, the routes every client Dominic ever touched. 300 grand, and I'll pay my wife back tomorrow. He was lying through his teeth, of course. He had no intention of settling his debts with Cressida. Julian Thorne sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving the folder. If this data is as clean as you say, Cassian, the transfer hits your account by Wednesday noon. He thinks he's selling my crown. He doesn't realize he's selling the rope for his own gallows. I watched the recording, a cold amusement settling in my chest, as my son continued to dig a deeper criminal hole with every sentence. Robert Hayes, my tech director for over a decade, and the only man who could outcode me, spoke with the dry, mechanical tone of a man who preferred logic to family drama when he called me on the other line. Dominic, he confirmed the honeypot was accessed an hour ago. The software too. Zero folder has been fully downloaded to his personal drive. I looked at the photos of Cassian bragging about outsmarting me, his hands gesturing wildly as he detailed his perceived victory. "Let him take it, Robert," I said, my fingers brushing the cold, smooth metal of the laptop lid. "He's not just selling data. He's selling his own indictment." I authorized the final release of the corrupted data package, the encryption keys, that would act as a digital virus the moment Titan tried to integrate them. Have you ever watched someone sell a lie so convincingly that they actually start to believe it themselves? That's the most dangerous stage of a downfall. Cassian reached across the table, his face split by a relieved, arrogant grin. "We have a deal," he said, his voice brimming with a false sense of security. "I'll deliver the encryption keys tomorrow morning." He shook hands with Thorne, believing he'd just saved his future. I sat back in my hotel chair watching the feed as Julian Thorne walked out with the manila folder. What Cassian didn't realize was that I had already seen his search history from the night before. He wasn't planning to stay and fight the bankruptcy. He had already booked a one-way ticket to Cancun for Friday morning. He was selling out his father and his rival to fund a permanent disappearance. I closed my laptop and looked out at the Denver skyline, knowing that by this time tomorrow, Titan Supply wouldn't be looking for a business partner. They'd be looking for a prosecutor. The ring of my desk phone on Wednesday afternoon was shrill and frantic, a jagged sound that told me the gift I'd left for Cassian had finally been opened. I sat in my temporary Chicago office base, the cold, steady feel of the mahogany desk beneath my palms offering a grounding contrast to the muffled roar of city traffic 16 floors below. I let the phone ring twice more before answering, savoring the anticipation of the fallout I had so carefully engineered. Elias Thorne, the general counsel for Titan Supply, was a man who spoke in billable minutes and legal threats. But today, his voice carried the thin, high pitch of a man whose career was on the line. "Mr. Vance, the database we acquired from your son is a virus," he barked, bypassing all professional pleasantries. "It's wiping our routing tables as we speak. Our entire logistical operation is hemorrhaging data, and Julian says you're the only one who can stop it." I took a slow breath, the scent of fresh toner and expensive leather in my office sharpening my focus. "Acquired?" I asked, my voice a model of feigned confusion. "Thornton Industrial hasn't held a valid software license since last Friday, Elias." What exactly did Julian think he was buying? The silence on the other end was heavy, punctuated only by Elias's ragged breathing. What he didn't know was that the corrupted data didn't just crash Titan's systems. It had already performed its primary function. As it dismantled their server architecture, it surreptitiously extracted Julian Thorne's personal emails, providing me with ironclad proof that Titan knowingly planned to use stolen intellectual property to poach Apex's new contracts. In the world of logistics, a corrupted link doesn't just stop the chain, it shatters it. I leaned back in my chair, watching the gray Chicago sky through the window. I am no longer the CEO of Thornton, Elias. I continued, my tone shifting to one of corporate dominance. If you purchased proprietary data from someone with no legal authority to sell it, that is a criminal acquisition issue. The data package Cassian sold you was a forensic trap, a honeypot designed to flag unauthorized access to assets that were transferred to Apex Global weeks ago. Have you ever noticed how quickly business partners turn into prosecution witnesses when the money vanishes? You bought garbage data from a man with no assets and a failing marriage. That's a Titan problem, not a Dominic problem. I could practically visualize a pulsing red error light on every server in Titan's headquarters as Elias began to sputter about lawsuits and injunctions. "I'd suggest you call the police," I said, the sharp plastic click of the phone receiver ready in my hand. "My son is quite sloppy with evidence. I'm sure he still has the wire transfer receipt in his pocket." It would be a pity for Julian to go down alone for a $250,000 fraud. Oh, and Elias, you might want to check your insurance policy. I believe most standard coverage excludes losses resulting from the criminal acquisition of property. That leaves the company and Julian personally liable for the $300,000 loss. I didn't wait for his response. I hung up the silence of the office, returning like a calm tide. I set the receiver down and looked at my second phone, the one with the encrypted line waiting for the call I knew was coming from a house in Ridgemont that was currently burning from the inside out. The vibration of my personal cell phone felt like a tectonic shift. I didn't need to see the caller ID to know that the silence in Cressida's new life had just been shattered by a ghost from her old one. I sat in my temporary Chicago office, the static on the long-distance line buzzing in my ear like a warning as the evening shadows stretched across my mahogany desk. "Dominic, I found it," Cressida whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of tears and raw adrenaline. The sound of her jagged, sobbing breath told me she was on the verge of a total collapse. She explained that while she was packing the very last of her boxes in the Ridgemont garage, she noticed a smell of old oil and turpentine coming from a heavy metal toolbox buried beneath several rusted paint cans. Tucked at the bottom, wrapped in a shop rag, was a second smartphone. I successfully unlocked it, using the password I'd seen Cassian use for his crypto accounts. She said, her voice trembling with a terrifying clarity. "It's a digital cesspool, Dominic. The betrayal goes so much deeper than just the money." I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white, the sharp pain in my hand grounding me. She revealed that the hidden device contained a group chat between Cassian Leonie and her niece Michelle. It wasn't just a thread, it was a curated record of malice. Cressida found photos of the $500,000 mortgage check they had used to strip her equity, showing Leonie and Cassian clinking glasses in celebration, while Cressida was literally in the next room. Before I expose the truth behind that group chat, if you're still watching this unfold with me, comment 1, if you think she should go to the police immediately, or 2, if she should wait for a lawyer. This next part contains some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. If you're not comfortable with dramatized details, feel free to stop watching here. Leonie wasn't just aware of the affair. She was the architect. I listened in grim, icy silence as Cressida read messages where my wife advised them on the best times to meet while Cressida was at work, even showing them how to hide Michelle's expensive lifestyle as company marketing expenses. How do you tell a woman who is 7 months pregnant that the family she married into viewed her as nothing more than a temporary incubator for their capital? The final blow was a medical document. Photo: Michelle is also pregnant with a due date just weeks after Cressida's. 2 babies, 1 husband, and a grandmother who saw them both as line items on a balance sheet. I let her finish before I spoke, my voice a cold, steady promise of retribution that seemed to silence the static on the line. "Cressida, I already have a forensic copy of that phone's cloud backup," I revealed. "I mirrored it months ago when Cassian accidentally synced it to a company laptop during a late-night session. I didn't tell you because I needed the legal leverage to be absolute before we moved." I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white and gave her the only promise that mattered. "Get the best lawyers in Colorado, Cressida. I'm paying the bill, and we're going to burn their trust to the ground." I let the silence settle between us for a moment. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I needed Cressida to feel the shift from being a victim of the Vance family to being the architect of their downfall. The Chicago night pressed against the high-rise glass, a metallic hum of a distant city that felt far cleaner than the air in Ridgemont. Cressida listened to me carefully. I said, my voice steady as I clicked a pen repeatedly, the sharp sound punctuating my thoughts. "I need you to stop packing. Leave the house immediately. Don't take the furniture, Cressida. Leave it all. Objects can be replaced. Your peace of mind cannot." I knew that once the Titan deal imploded, and the realization of the second phone reached Leonie, the desperation in that house would turn volatile. I explained that I had already retained a top-tier forensic accounting firm to track the $500,000 mortgage path. I'm not just paying for a divorce lawyer, I promised her. I'm building a fortress around you and my grandchild. What she didn't know, what even my lawyers hadn't processed yet, was that I had been recording this entire phone call with her consent. Every word she uttered was being time-stamped and transcribed for immediate court filings. I was turning her trauma into a legal arsenal. Money is a motive, but erasing a person, that's an addiction. I leaned back, my eyes dry and stinging as I looked at the cold blue glow of my monitors. Cressida's voice dropped an octave, trembling, as she revealed a final detail from that hidden phone. Leonie had been coaching Cassian for over 2 years on how to make me feel senile. The messages were a surgical guide to gaslighting, moving my appointments, questioning my memory of conversations that never happened, all to ensure I'd doubt my own mind and retire early. They didn't just want the money, Dominic, she whispered. They wanted to turn you into a ghost in your own life. The woman I had shared a bed with for 35 years had viewed me as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a partner to be loved. How do you mourn a marriage that was actually a 35-year-long con? We are no longer just fighting for a business. Cressida, I told her, my heart feeling like a heavy stone. We are fighting for the right to exist, without being erased by Leonie's greed. This diagram illustrates the complex path Leonie used to hide the mortgage funds. The betrayal moved from corporate to generational when Cressida mentioned that Leonie had even tried to take out a high-value life insurance policy on me 6 months ago, claiming I was high risk due to stress. She wasn't just waiting for me to retire. She was calculating the value of my absence. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago winter. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a greedy wife. I was dealing with a sociopath who had spent decades curating a lie. I hung up the phone and looked at the wedding photo on my desk, the one I'd carried to Chicago in a moment of misplaced sentimentality. I ran a thumb over the cold, smooth surface of the frame and realized I wasn't looking at my wife. I was looking at the most dangerous competitor I'd ever faced. The lines were drawn, and the war was no longer silent. I didn't hear the sirens until they were pulling into the executive lot of my Chicago headquarters. But I'd seen the shadow of this moment coming from the second Cassian realized he couldn't outwork me. He has always preferred the shortcut of a well-told lie to the long road of a hard truth. I remained in my chair, the glass of the Chicago high-rise cold against my shoulder, and thought of the bait I had set months ago. I had intentionally left a specific security flaw in the old Denver server, a clumsy, obvious vulnerability that only a non-coder like Cassian would find. I knew that when the walls closed in, his desperation would drive him to fabricate evidence, and I had paved the way for him to commit this specific act of perjury. Back in Denver, the pressure must have reached a boiling point. Cassian and Leonie were facing total financial ruin and the looming threat of criminal fraud charges from Titan Supply. In a desperate bid to flip the script, Leonie had convinced her son that the best defense was a swift, dirty offense. "If we don't put him in a cell, we're the ones going to prison," she had likely whispered, her voice a poison he was all too eager to drink. Cassian had gone to the Denver Police Department, presenting amateurish forged technical logs and claiming I had hacked the company server to steal proprietary code he supposedly developed. The detectives, seeing the urgent corporate documents and the frantic son of a local titan, had secured a warrant for felony theft of intellectual property. A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth even gets its boots on, but in the digital age, the truth leaves a timestamp. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of police boots on the marble floor of the lobby 16 stories below, a sound that resonated through the building's steel skeleton. Angela Morrison and Robert Hayes were in my office, their faces masks of confusion as the door was pushed open. 2 Denver detectives, looking weary from the flight and flanked by 4 local Chicago officers, entered the room. The smell of ozone and wet pavement from the Chicago streets seemed to cling to their heavy coats. Dominic Vance, you're under arrest for felony theft of intellectual property, the lead detective announced, his voice flat and professional. Angela's hand went to her mouth, and Robert stood up, his jaw set in defiance. I remained unnervingly calm, merely extending my hand for the paperwork. The cold, clinical feel of the warrant was exactly what I expected. Have you ever felt the cold weight of steel on your wrists and realized it was the lightest thing you'd carried in years, as the metallic click of the handcuffs signaled my transition to the state's custody? I looked at the lead detective. Angela, call Philip Grayson. I said, my voice steady. Tell him it's code red. Robert, don't touch the server logs. I'll be back by dinner. As they led me toward the elevator, I noticed the detective was holding a manila envelope identical to the one Cassian had brandished at Thanksgiving. It was a small detail, but it proved Leonie's fingerprints were all over this evidence. Cassian had even tipped off the media. The lobby was filled with the blinding white light of camera flashes as they waited for my perp walk. The cameras blinded me as they pushed me into the back of the squad car, but through the glare, I saw the one thing Cassian had forgotten. The forensic clock was already ticking. The echo of the iron door closing in the holding cell was a sound I had prepared for, but sitting at the defense table in the Denver commercial court felt like the true beginning of the end. I didn't look at the gallery where Leonie sat with her chin high, clinging to a dignity that was currently bleeding out. I kept my eyes on the monitor in front of the judge, waiting for the binary code to do what my family never could tell the truth. Judge Evelyn Vance, no relation much to Leonie's chagrin, sat behind the mahogany bench with the weary patience of a woman who had seen too many rich sons try to play make-believe with the law. The cold, dry air of the Justice Center carried the faint smell of old paper and industrial floor wax, a clinical atmosphere where my life's work was about to be laid bare. Philip Grayson, my lead counsel, was a man who viewed the law like a high-speed engine, precise, powerful, and utterly unforgiving to those who didn't respect the mechanics. He stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the linoleum. Your Honor, my client has 12 years of commits in a secure remote Git repository, he stated, signaling for the screen to come to life. Green code began scrolling across the high-definition monitor, a digital heartbeat that documented every hour I'd spent in the dark. Philip demonstrated that every single line of the proprietary routing software had a forensic timestamp and an IP address linked to my private servers dating back to 2013. I had even intentionally embedded my own social security number in the encrypted comments of the source code years ago as a digital watermark for exactly this scenario. A forensic analyst took the stand, testifying that the logs Cassian provided to the police were amateurish exports created less than 72 hours ago. The metadata doesn't lie, Your Honor. The analyst said, his voice a steady hum beneath the whir of the courtroom server fans. These logs were born 3 days after the Thanksgiving dinner, forged on a laptop in the Ridgemont study. A man who can't read a map shouldn't claim he discovered the continent. I watched Cassian's face go from confident to a sickly ashen gray as the metadata stripped away his lies. Robert Hayes took the stand next, testifying that he had worked alongside me for a decade and that my son couldn't even navigate a basic command line without assistance. Have you ever seen the exact moment a lie collapses? It doesn't make a sound. It just leaves a man staring at a screen he doesn't understand. Growing skeptical, the judge ordered Cassian to the stand. The witness stand chair gave a sharp, agonizing squeak as he sat. She pointed to a specific critical function in the routing algorithm displayed on the screen. Mr. Vance, if this is your architecture, please explain why you chose a binary search here instead of a hash map. Cassian stammers, his eyes darting frantically between the judge and the screen. I had developers, he managed, his voice thin. I provided the vision. The technical details were managed. Philip didn't let him breathe. He revealed that the technical logs Cassian forged were actually copied from an open-source tutorial website, including the original author's hidden copyright notes that Cassian was too incompetent to find. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a lethality that made the court reporter stop typing, and I knew the next words out of her mouth wouldn't be a question, but a sentence. The gavel didn't just hit the wooden block. It sounded the death knell for the Vance name in the state of Colorado. The heavy thud echoed through the chamber, vibrating against the soles of my shoes as the judge cleared her throat. I stood tall at the defense table, the cold, clinical smell of the courtroom air finally losing its metallic edge of fear and being replaced by the sweet, dry scent of victory. What Cassian hadn't accounted for was the depth of my preparation. I had already sent the complete forensic Git repository to the judge's clerk in a sealed preemptive discovery filing 48 hours before the police even knocked on my Chicago door. I didn't wait to be attacked. I had positioned the shield before the arrow was even notched. Mr. Dominic Vance. You are free to go, the judge announced, her voice carrying a resonant authority that silenced the room. This court offers its deepest apologies for this orchestrated farce. She turned her gaze toward the prosecution, her eyes flashing with a righteous fire. This wasn't a mistake, Your Honor. I added my voice calm and authoritative as I buttoned my suit jacket. It was a weaponization of the law. The judge nodded slowly, then delivered a blistering rebuke to the district attorney's office for their failure to perform even the most basic due diligence on an obvious and clumsy fabrication. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction blooming in my chest as I watched the lead detective from the arrest lower his head in shame. The law is a mirror. If you come to it with a crooked soul, it will show you exactly how broken you are. Before the room could clear, the judge ordered the bailiff to secure the exits. The sharp click of the locks was the only sound in the sudden heavy silence. She pointed directly at Cassian, whose red puffy face was now a mask of pure terror as he tried to slink toward Leonie. Bailiff, take Mr. Cassian Vance into custody, she commanded. I'm referring this entire file to the state attorney for immediate criminal prosecution for felony perjury, filing a false police report, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom remained frozen as the sharp click of steel handcuffs, the very ones Cassian had intended for me, closed around his wrists. Umshal could do something. He shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. Philip, tell them it was a mistake. Have you ever seen a mother watch her child go to prison and realize she was the one who handed him the keys to the cell? Leonie let out a sharp, jagged intake of breath, her face the color of wet ash as she watched her only remaining proxy asset being led toward the holding cells. As Cassian was hauled away, Leonie tried to adjust her posture, her hand fluttering toward her pearls as if preparing a speech about her own innocence. However, the judge wasn't finished. She noted on the record that Leonie's own notary stamp had been used on the forged documents, a detail that linked her inextricably to the fraud. I walked past my wife without a word, but the way she clutched her necklace as she looked at the empty seat beside her told me she finally understood the cost of a legacy built on sand. She was no longer a queen. She was a witness to her own destruction. The fluorescent hum of the law office conference room was a clinical contrast to the warm, lye-filled chandelier light of the Ridgemont dining room, but the truth here was just as sharp. I took my seat at the heavy mahogany table, the smell of high-end floor wax and lemon polish clinging to the sterile air. Elena Vance, Cressida's lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with no relation to me, looked at the evidence through spectacles that seemed to magnify the sheer ugliness of the Vance family secrets. Beside her, a court reporter, a man who had likely seen 1,000 divorces and didn't even flinch at the sight of ruin, prepared his stenotype machine. The rhythmic clicking began the moment I started my sworn testimony, a cold and factual account of a corporate structure built on air. I detailed how Leonie had forced Cassian into a VP role he was utterly unqualified for, documenting years of professional negligence. My son didn't run operations. He ran an expensive social calendar on the company dime. I stated, my voice echoing in the artificial glare of the office lights. I presented evidence of ghost deals where Cassian had claimed credit for my work to inflate his perceived value before the takeover attempt. Every strategic vision he presented was a plagiarized version of a memo I wrote at 3 in the morning while he was asleep. I even highlighted how Leonie tried to characterize specific maternity payments as research and development in the company ledgers to avoid detection, a clumsy attempt to hide a secret that was already outgrowing its container. There is no bottom to the pit some people will dig when they're fueled by vanity and a stolen checkbook. I took a sip of bitter, lukewarm conference room coffee and watched Elena turn a crisp legal page. The deposition shifted from corporate theft to a deeper, more visceral form of betrayal. Elena introduced new financial discovery secondary off-books payments Leonie had authorized for a high-end maternity clinic in Scottsdale. The patient wasn't Cressida. It was Michelle. I felt a wave of moral disgust as the timeline was laid bare. These clinic dates overlap with Cressida's second trimester, almost to the day I noted the weight of the revelation settling like lead in my stomach. Leonie wasn't just hiding an affair. She was financing a parallel lineage. How many versions of a family legacy can one woman try to build before she realizes she's just a slumlord of her own bloodline? The records showed Leonie had been funding a secret, luxurious lifestyle for her niece, ensuring the girl was cared for while my daughter-in-law was being systematically gaslit. It was a calculated move to replace Cressida entirely. I discovered then that Leonie had already promised Michelle that her child would be the primary heir to the Vance empire once Cressida was successfully pushed out of the picture. She was treating human beings like assets to be traded or liquidated. I walked out of the office an hour later, the cold air of the parking garage doing little to clear the taste of lukewarm coffee and old lies from my mouth. I sat in my car in total silence, processing the fact that Cassian had 2 babies on the way and a mother who had managed them both like inventory. My phone buzzed in the cup holder with a notification from my real estate alert. A for sale sign had just been hammered into the frozen lawn at Ridgemont. The liquidation was no longer just a legal theory. It was now physical. I stood in the center of the warehouse I'd built from a 2-truck operation, watching men in cheap suits tag my life's work with neon orange stickers like they were marking meat for a clearance sale. The smell of coal diesel exhaust and dust hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud for Thornton Industrial Supply. The auctioneer was a man with a voice like gravel in a blender and a heart that clearly beat for commission only. He began his rapid-fire chant, a rhythmic assault that turned decades of logistics and innovation into mere line items. Lot number 4, 8240 Freightliner M2s. Do I hear 1 million? The chant continued, the 40-truck fleet, the automated sorting arms, and even the office furniture being sold off to satisfy the $2.3 million debt Cassian had personally guaranteed. I watched with a detached clinical interest as regional competitors picked over the bones. They looked at me with a mix of pity and greed, but they didn't understand the fundamental truth: a vessel is worthless without the water. It's just scrap metal now, isn't it? Dominic, one rival, whispered, his eyes gleaming with a victory he hadn't earned. Without your routing code, these trucks are just expensive lawn ornaments. I offered him a silent, enigmatic nod. What the room didn't know, what even the bank hadn't processed yet, was that I was actually the anonymous, stalking horse bidder. Through a shell company, I had just bought the warehouse building itself. An empire doesn't fall with a bang. It falls with the sound of a mallet hitting a wooden stake. I was now Leonie and Cassian's landlord for the final 30 days of their eviction. I pulled my collar up against the biting cold of the Denver winter air and walked toward my car. The show at the warehouse was over, but the final act at Ridgemont Heights was just beginning. I drove past the mansion one last time, the tires of my SUV crunching on the frozen asphalt. The house was a beautiful shell, but the inhabitants were just hermit crabs fighting over a space they never truly owned. A real estate agent was supervising as a heavy mallet, hit the frozen ground, driving a massive for sale sign into the soil. Leonie stood on the porch, wrapped in a fur coat that was likely the next thing to be sold, looking at the sign as if it were a tombstone. The bank doesn't care about your social standing, Leonie, I thought, as I watched her from the curb. They only care about the equity you drained. She spotted my car, and her face contorted. You did this! She shrieked, her voice thin in the wind. You stripped us bare. It was a desperate lie. She had stripped herself bare the moment she tried to sell my personal collection of vintage watches and the family silver to cover her debts. She didn't know I had already replaced them with high-quality fakes months ago, leaving the real assets in a secure vault miles away. I pulled away from the curb, the image of the for sale sign fading in my rearview mirror. But the sight of a moving truck pulling up to the back entrance, ordered by Michelle, not Leonie, told me the final betrayal was just beginning to pack its bags. The family legacy was no longer a kingdom. It was a heap of cardboard boxes waiting for the next rain. The silent vibration of my phone on the nightstand didn't just wake me. It signaled the final, desperate gasp of a dying era. I sat up in the darkness of my hotel room, the cold blue glow of the screen illuminating the room as I opened the high-priority security alert. My remote feed from the Aurora facility flared to life, showing a grainy hooded figure slinking against the loading dock doors. Even through the digital noise, I recognized the distinctive rhythmic gait and the sharp flash of a designer scarf I'd bought for our 25th anniversary. It was Leonie. Driven to a frantic madness by the loss of the Ridgemont mansion and the freezing of her overseas accounts, she was pouring accelerant against the heavy steel doors. If I can't have the legacy, Dominic, no one can. She seemed to hiss at the shadows. She struck a match, intending to burn the only thing she thought I still loved, to the ground, unaware that the building she was attacking was now legally mine. What she also didn't know was that I had doubled the building's fire insurance policy the very week after our Thanksgiving disaster. I knew her penchant for scorched earth endings better than anyone. Fire is an honest element. It only consumes what is already dead. The flames caught a sudden orange bloom that licked against the metal, but before the heat could even blister the paint, the industrial sprinkler system triggered with surgical precision. I had personally overseen the overhaul of those pipes 6 months ago, an investment Leonie had called a pathetic waste of capital. The rhythmic, piercing wail of the warehouse fire alarm cut through the night, a sound that automatically routed high-definition footage of her face directly to the arson squad. I arrived on the scene 40 minutes later, the heavy metallic taste of adrenaline and regret coating my tongue. The smell of gasoline and wet ash was thick in the cold, stinging night rain. I found Leonie soaked to the bone and shivering in the back of a squad car, her manicured hands still clutching a half-empty gas can like a holy relic. I stood in the rain, watching the orange flames die under the relentless hiss of the overhead system. I told you 6 months ago the seals on these pipes were the most important investment in this building. I said, my voice barely a whisper against the downpour. You called it a waste of money. She looked up at me, her face a mask of ruined mascara and hatred. You're a monster, Dominic. You trapped me. If you want to destroy a man's life, don't attack his property. Property is replaceable. Attack his silence. But Leonie was always too loud for that. As the fire marshals began dousing the last of the embers, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Michelle. She was the one who had tipped me off about Leonie's plan 2 hours ago, hoping to secure a deal for her own child's future by selling out the woman who had groomed her. The cycle of betrayal had simply moved to a new generation. The blue and red lights reflected in the puddles of soot-stained water as I turned my back on the woman I'd known for 35 years, leaving her to the only flame she couldn't extinguish, the law. I walked toward my car, the sound of the sirens fading into the steady drum of the rain, feeling the absolute weight of the Vance name finally wash away into the Aurora gutters. I pressed the space bar on my laptop, and the silence of my Chicago office was replaced by the low-frequency hum of a police interrogation room 300 miles away. The antiseptic blue glow of the screen illuminated the steam rising from my coffee, a cold contrast to the heavy rhythmic ticking of the clock on my office wall. On the recording, the hiss and crackle of digital audio couldn't hide the sound of Leonie's heavy, uneven breathing. Detective Miller had a voice like sandpaper, and a patience that suggested he'd spent 20 years listening to wealthy people realize they weren't above the law. "Mrs. Vance, we have you on 3 different cameras," Miller's voice droned. "The accelerant was purchased with your personal card." Leonie's response was a brittle, panicked deflection. "I didn't mean to burn it. I just wanted to stop him. He took everything that made me someone." What sickened me most, however, was the first 10 minutes of the tape, where she had tried to blame the entire arson plot on Cassian attempting to throw our son under the bus to save her own skin. A confession isn't an apology. It's just the final invoice of a moral bankruptcy. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the waveform of her voice, feeling a clinical detachment that felt like a shield. She didn't know this recording was being shared with me. She believed she was making a secret plea deal in exchange for information on the mortgage fraud. As the tape rolled, her composure shattered. She stopped lying and started confessing to the broader conspiracy with a chilling, detached pride. "Dominic was the engine, yes, but I was the driver." She whispered, her voice gaining a sharp edge. "He didn't understand that drivers deserve more than the fuel. He was a utility. A cog that refused to turn when I needed it to. Have you ever heard the person you loved for 30 years describe you as an asset and realized you were the only one who thought you were a human being?" She detailed how she had groomed Cassian to be her proxy, a vessel for her social standing, because she viewed my blood as too weak to sustain the Vance empire on its own. She even admitted to the secret maternity payments for Michelle, framing it as a necessary backup plan for the family name, a parallel lineage she could control once I was retired or dead. The moral vacuum she described was larger than any financial hole I had dismantled. I realized then that I wasn't just listening to a criminal. I was listening to the architect of a 35-year-long con. She spoke of her life insurance attempts on me as simple business risk management, as if she were insuring a warehouse instead of a husband. The recording was the sound of a woman who had never seen people, only pieces on a board. The audio clicked into static, leaving me in a silence so profound I could hear the snow hitting the high-rise window. But the last word she whispered, a name I hadn't expected, changed the math of my entire revenge. It wasn't the name of a business rival or a hidden account. It was a name that suggested the betrayal had started long before Cassian was even born. I closed the laptop, the blue light fading as I looked at the file on my desk, with Michelle's real legal name on the cover. The game wasn't over. The board had just expanded. The IRS is like a deep-sea predator. They don't hunt by sight, but by the electrical pulse of money moving where it doesn't belong. I sat in the silence of my Chicago high-rise after everyone else had gone home, the cold, clinical blue light of the bank transfer screens reflecting off my glasses. For months, I had been waiting for the poison pill I left in our third-quarter tax filings to take effect. It was a deliberate, glaring discrepancy, a small, loose thread that, once pulled by an auditor, would unravel every related entity Leonie thought she owned. The name she had whispered on that interrogation tape. Grayson confirmed my final suspicion. She had tried to bribe Philip, my own lead counsel, to flip on me months ago. She didn't realize that Philip viewed the law like a high-speed engine, and his loyalty to the man who built that engine was absolute. He had been recording her offers from the very first phone call. Agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division didn't bother with a polite knock. They arrived at the Ridgemont house and Leonie's new condo, simultaneously serving seizure warrants that turned her sanctuary into a crime scene. "You can't seize this," she shrieked on the remote audio feed I was monitoring. "This is an irrevocable trust. It's protected by law." I watched the transcript of the agent's reply scroll across my screen with a sense of calculating justice. Ma'am, a trust built on fraudulent transfers isn't a shield. It's a crime scene. They began documenting decades of personal expenses, jewelry, international travel, and exclusive country club fees, all clumsily disguised as logistics consulting and vendor relations. 0. That is the final balance of a life lived as a parasite. I watched as the legal barriers Leonie spent 30 years building were dismantled in a single afternoon. The court-appointed receiver moved with a clinical efficiency, liquidating the trust to pay back taxes, interest, and penalties that exceeded $4.2 million. Every asset she had used to define herself, the Scottsdale condo, the offshore accounts, and the hidden cash reserves, was swallowed by the government. Philip Grayson walked into my office, then the smell of ozone from the printer running all night following him. "She's flat broke, Dominic," he said, dropping a final report on my desk. "For the first time since she was 20, she has to check the price of a gallon of milk." "I didn't take it from her, Philip," I replied, my voice steady. "I just stopped being the one who paid the bill for her lies. Do you know what happens to a socialite when the gold plating is stripped away? They realize they're just common lead, and lead is heavy enough to sink anyone. But the closure went deeper than just the tax man. I had quietly purchased the debt notes for the luxury condo Leonie had retreated to, using a shell company she would never recognize. I was now her personal landlord, holding the power to evict her at any moment of my choosing. I wasn't just the man she betrayed. I was the floor beneath her feet, and I could pull it away whenever I pleased. I closed the final ledger and felt the scratchy texture of a single handwritten envelope sitting on the corner of my desk. It was from the prison where my son was currently trading his designer suits for orange polyester. The weight of the Vance legacy was finally resting in that one small piece of paper, waiting for the final word. I didn't go to the prison to see the orange jumpsuit. I went to a suburban Home Depot to see the blue polyester vest that represented the only honest day's work my son had ever done. The smell of sawdust and industrial adhesive was a grounding reality. As I walked through the sliding automatic doors, a sharp contrast to the sterile, high-altitude air of the Chicago offices I now called home. I found him at the far end of aisle 14, Cassian, once the heir apparent, who demanded $1 million corner office and Italian leather seating, was currently fumbling with a handheld barcode scanner. I watched him from the shadows of a display of water heaters, noting the physical toll of his new life. His soft, manicured hands were red and covered in fresh calluses as he struggled to lift a bundle of heavy 10-foot PVC pipes. The hollow, echoing clang of the plastic hitting the metal rack resonated through the aisle like a mocking applause. What he never suspected was that I was the one who quietly lobbied the work release board to place him in the plumbing department specifically. I wanted him surrounded by the industrial roots he once mocked, a constant reminder of the grit he lacked. "Need help with those, son?" I asked, stepping into the orange glow of the setting sun that filtered through the high skylights. "They're heavier than a corporate ledger, aren't they?" Cassian flinched at the sound of my voice, nearly dropping the scanner. "I have 3 more pallets to clear before my shift ends." "Dad," he spat, his voice devoid of its former silkiness. "I don't have time for a speech." I looked at the abrasive texture of his blue vest and the way he wouldn't meet my eyes. "PVC is a lot like my family. It looks solid from the outside, but under enough pressure it's just hollow plastic meant to carry waste." I didn't come to gloat, though the sight was admittedly poetic. I reached into my coat and pulled out a printed photo. I set it on the edge of a flatbed cart between us. It was Cressida's new son. "He has your eyes, Cassian," I said softly, watching the low, persistent hum of a forklift in the distance. "Let's hope he doesn't inherit your mother's appetite." I informed him that the Apex Scholarship had been established for the boy funded entirely by the liquidated assets Cassian had tried to steal. "You're actually going to let me rot here stocking plastic?" he asked, a flash of the old entitlement sparking in his eyes. If you're looking for a happy ending, you've come to the wrong warehouse. In this business, you get exactly what you've maintained. I turned to leave my footsteps silent on the concrete floor. Michelle, the niece he'd chosen over his wife, had already reached out to me. She traded her testimony against Leonie for a minor trust fund for her own child, which I had approved an hour before arriving. The parasites were finally eating each other. I walked out into the cool evening air, the sliding automatic doors hissing shut behind me like the final closing of a tomb. As I turned the key in my new car, I realized I was finally truly alone, and for the first time in my life, that was exactly what I wanted. I drove away into the deepening shadows, leaving the wreckage of the Vance name in the rearview mirror where it belonged. I stood at the head of a glass table that didn't feel like a throne, looking out at a team that didn't look like subjects. The Chicago skyline sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling glass of our new headquarters, a tapestry of lights that signaled the one-year anniversary of Apex Global. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive wine filled the boardroom, but this wasn't the suffocating, performative feast of the Ridgemont mansion. This was a friendsgiving. We didn't just rebuild a supply chain. We built a circle of trust, I said, raising my glass to Robert Hayes, Angela Morrison, and Philip Grayson. That is our most valuable asset. The room felt warm, anchored by mutual respect, rather than the parasitic greed that had defined my previous life. Apex Global had reached a $50 million valuation in just 12 months, primarily because we had become the primary contractor for the very clients Cassian and Titan Supply had tried to poach. I had successfully hired the best parts of the ruins I left behind, leaving the rot to bury itself. To the man who finally realized that a legacy isn't what you take, but what you leave behind, Philip toasted, his voice steady and sincere. A business is just a machine, but a family is a garden. If you only focus on the output and forget to water the roots, eventually everything turns to dust. I had spent decades maintaining the machine while my own garden withered, but I was finally learning how to be a husband to my craft and a father to my principles. A week later, I traveled back to Colorado, but I didn't head for the country clubs or the gated communities. I drove to a modest, sun-drenched home where the warmth of a real fireplace replaced the mocking glow of the Ridgemont hearth. If you're still looking for the man who sat at that Thanksgiving table last year, you're looking for a ghost. I buried him in a Chicago skyscraper, and I haven't missed him for a second. Cressida Morgan met me at the door, her face glowing with a peace I hadn't seen during her time as a Vance. She led me into the nursery where I met my grandson for the first time. He was named Leo. After a grandfather, I actually respected a man who worked with his hands and kept his word. The soft, milky scent of the newborn baby hit me with a force that no corporate victory ever could. "He won't grow up in a shadow, Cressida," I whispered, reaching into my bag. I pulled out heavy premium vellum trust documents, an irrevocable fund, fueled by my Apex Global Founders shares. "This trust ensures he'll only ever see the light." "Thank you," Dominic, Cressida replied, her eyes damp. Not for the money, but for being the only one who actually meant the word family. I felt a profound sense of generational healing as I handed her the papers. What even Cressida didn't fully realize yet was that the trustee I had selected for the fund was Michelle. The former mistress had turned her life around, becoming a fierce protector of both her own child and Leo against any future machinations from Leonie. The allies I had found in the wreckage were stronger than the blood I had lost. I looked down at the child sleeping in my arms, his tiny hand gripping my thumb with a strength I hadn't expected. And for the first time in 60 years, I knew exactly what I was working for. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists when you have finally paid off every debt, emotional and financial, that was ever used to keep you small. I stood in my minimalist Chicago apartment, watching the pre-dawn snow fall over Lake Michigan. The The cold blue light of the morning made the room feel like a sanctuary rather than a cell. On my desk sat the last physical remnant of the life I had dismantled, the old wedding photo I had taken from the Ridgemont mansion. I looked at Leonie's smiling face captured in a moment of staged perfection and realized with a start that I no longer felt the familiar heat of anger. I only felt a detached pity for a woman who had spent 35 years chasing a status that had dissolved like salt in the rain. "You were a masterpiece of marketing, Leonie," I whispered to the empty room. But the product was always empty. "I'm not erasing you. I'm just finally turning the page." I slid the photo into the opening of the shredder. The rhythmic whir of the machine was the only sound in the apartment, as the last piece of my old history turned into tiny strips of white paper, confetti. That's all 35 years of legacy looks like when it hits the blades. I didn't feel a sense of loss, only a profound, weightless liberation. My life was no longer a balance sheet for someone else to audit. I arrived at O'Hare International Airport 2 hours later, with nothing but a single carry-on bag and a ticket for the morning flight to London. The smell of jet fuel and expensive terminal coffee was the scent of a beginning. While waiting at the gate, I checked my tablet one last time. A news notification flashed. Cassian had been transitioned to a permanent correctional facility, and Leonie's personal bankruptcy filing had been finalized. I shut down the device, realizing that my flight was actually a mission. I was heading to London to meet a venture capital group to finalize a foundation for single mothers who had suffered financial abuse, naming it the Cressida Initiative. It was the only way to ensure that the capital I had rescued would serve a purpose beyond vanity. Have you ever wondered what you would do if you could finally stop carrying everyone else's weight? You'd fly. The gate agent possessed the rehearsed smile of someone who saw people leaving their lives behind every single hour as she scanned my boarding pass. "Business or pleasure, Mr. Vance?" she asked. "Neither," I replied, offering her a genuine smile. "Just a change in management." I walked down the jet bridge, the noise of the terminal fading behind me. As I settled into the soft leather gave of my first-class seat, I felt the noise-canceling headphones click on, creating a perfect vacuum of peace. I left one final gift for Leonie, a prepaid lifelong subscription to the business journals that would feature Apex Global Success on the cover every month. She would have to read about my life on the terms she once valued most. I settled into my seat and watched the Chicago skyline disappear beneath a blanket of white, a clean slate for the man who had finally learned that the only empire worth owning is the one inside your own chest. The Vance name was dead, but for the first time in 60 years, I was truly alive. Looking back at this family story, I have to admit something uncomfortable. I didn't just build a company. I built a battlefield inside my own home. My silence, my obsession with control, and my pride helped create the very war that led to this dad revenge. I told myself I was protecting my legacy, but in truth, I neglected the emotional foundation of my own family story. Don't be like me. Don't wait until betrayal forces you into a calculated dad revenge just to prove your worth. Speak early. Set boundaries before resentment becomes strategy. A business can be rebuilt. A family once fractured rarely returns whole. This family story taught me that winning legally does not always mean winning spiritually. Yes, I defended myself. Yes, my dad revenge was precise. But I also lost years to anger and ego. If I could go back, I would choose clarity over silence and courage over endurance. I believe God allowed this collapse not to destroy me, but to strip away the illusion that power equals love. A true legacy is not domination, it is integrity. And no revenge, however justified, replaces peace. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done if you were in Dominic's position, facing betrayal at the Thanksgiving table? I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos. Gentle reminder. While inspired by corporate power struggles and family conflict themes, certain elements have been dramatized for narrative impact. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other stories that better match your interests. A brief note: while inspired by social dynamics and real-world themes, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Please remember to adjust the bracketed variables in each upload to avoid repetitive formatting flags.